Hey, everyone.
Hi.
Hey.
Morning, folks.
Good morning.
We'll give people a couple of minutes to filter in since our attendee list is a little bit bigger than the set of folks who are here right now. Also, just a reminder that if you haven't added your name to the agenda, please send a quick pull request. And I'll just be merging pull requests for the next couple of minutes just to catch anything that we might have missed.
Hi, Lee.
Morning, Yvonne. Or I guess morning for me and probably not morning for you, probably evening for you.
Yeah, evening. So it sounds on background. I wanted to ask you, because we have some discussion with Benji about spec and user after. So it's like, both approaches work, but so somebody need to decide where we're going. I will send you an issue. It would be great if you like answer what was the right direction. Should we have like grammar as markdown, or should it be like code blocks?
Yeah, Benji's been sending me some messages too about improving the spec MD tool to be more resilient to those changes, which I think is great. I'd love to be able to use prettier on the spec if it means one less thing for people to worry about. If it doesn't work, then like we'll find out that it doesn't work. But if along the way we can make improvements, all the better.
It's basically done. It works.
Oh, hell yeah. Nice work.
The one trick I added for our agendas is when you're prettying Markdown or auto formatting, you can add the ignore blocks around the attendees list, because people will usually add those in line without creating, just through the GitHub UI. So I found if you just have like an ignore block for that, everything, that's usually the only conflict you'll have with auto formatting.
I see. Hopefully our agenda and notes can just be auto-formatted. I think the only one that we really need to be worried about is the actual spec text, where we're like interpreting it in a specific way.
Yeah.
I actually think like it's not only prettier, but in the long run, we would want to like spell checking, or maybe there is some linters for technical documentation.
Yeah,
because
it's been on my list for a long time. I would love to do that.
Yeah, so I think we need to consider like this entire roadmap. So like my problem with current approach is that grammar rules are part of Markdown.
Mm-hmm.
So always tools think it's like text. So if we run like spell checker think it is grammar rules is like a text, and like other tools. Actually, one thing I wanted to ask your opinion about, as like there was discussion about translating spec, but I think it's like too much work to keep it up to date. Plus, it's like not developer documentation; it's more like a spec. But one thing that will help non-native speaker, including me, if we can limit our vocabulary to like some like pretty big set of words, but still like maybe like 5,000 most frequently used words, because some of the words is in a spec, they have like very subtle meaning, which make it hard to
That's actually a really good point. You know, I think we can come at that from a lot of different directions. You can come at that from whether English is not your first language, which for a huge chunk of the GraphQL community, that is true. But also just like your level of competency and your ability to interpret the spec. I think one of the problems that we've had with ambiguity in the past has been actually just properly interpreting language and trying to be more crisp. So I see all those as overlapping concerns. But I really like this idea. Yeah, I don't know if there's existing tools that help you spot confusing text or difficult to interpret words, but I'd be totally up for trying something like a banned list of words that are kind of known to be confusing with suggested alternatives. That'd be pretty nice.
Yeah, there is like editors for technical writers. It's like not a lot of them, but they exist.
I was using the Write Good linter for a little bit. It's just called Write Good. It's based on like an abstract linter, and then there's like a VS Code implementation. But I was a little underimpressed by that one. So
okay,
just so you know.
Good to know. Yeah, I've encountered a couple of them that are all of mixed quality, but you know, maybe something is better than nothing. I'm totally open to trying stuff and kind of see what effect it has. But anyway, it looks like our attendee list is starting to stabilize. So thanks everyone for joining. We'll kind of officially kick off the meeting. Pull up my agenda here. So as always, we kick off with a reminder that everyone here is in agreement with the spec membership agreement. Hopefully you all have signed that, but kind of by joining, you explicitly agree to that. We also all agree to participation guidelines for how we operate on the spec and the code of conduct. Got that out of the way. Any additions to the attendee list? I will keep looking at pull requests. So if you forgot to add yourself, just feel free to add one of those in the next few minutes, and I'll just be kind of merging them in as I find them. Next, as we always do, we should go around the room and do just a quick name to a face, quick intro. They knows who they're talking to, and we'll go in order in the agenda as it's written right now. So hit a quick reload on that and start at the top. Top name is me. So hey everybody, I'm Lee. Ricky, you're next.
Hey, I'm Ricky. I'm from Gatsby. They pay me full time to work on GraphQL and the plugin API we're developing.
Hey everyone, I'm Benji. I'm working on the GraphQL projects, and I'm also interested in the input unions, RFC, and general maintenance of the spec.
Hi, my name is Ivan. I help to maintain GraphQL.js. Hopefully, we'll have more people in the team. Right now, I'm helping to mentor a couple of people. So mostly interested in GraphQL.js and how it's like work with the spec.
Hey everyone, I'm Courtney, co-founder at Hippie, and we're using GraphQL, especially the SDL, as the main way for our customers to provide schema definitions in our platform.
Hey, I'm Morris from IBM, working on a GraphQL proxy and interested in several of these topics for today.
Hi, I'm Alan. I'm from IBM Research. I work on an open source project called Open Unified GraphQL. I'm also interested in GraphQL API management like Morris. Hello.
Benedict?
Oh, is Alan not here? All right. Yeah, hi, I'm Benedict. I work on Lighthouse and recently also joined GraphQL PHP.
Nice.
I'm Steven. I work at Netflix and I work on QL infrastructure.
Folks, I'm Vince. I work at New Relic on our APIs, and I'm a co-maintainer of Absinthe GraphQL library for Elixir.
I don't think Evan is here yet. We'll skip him.
Okay, I'll go. Hi, I'm Andrew from TakeShape. We create a GraphQL API platform as a service.
Hi, I'm Gabriel McAdams. I'm at PayPal, but I'm also hoping that I signed the thing as me personally, and so I want to join this not as PayPal, but as me. So, hello.
Nice. Nice background, by the way.
And it is my real house.
Love it. Did we miss anyone? Nice. Total coverage. Love it. Awesome. Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. Is anybody interested in volunteering to take notes? I see there's already magic happening. Who do I give credit for all this great magic?
That'll be me, I think, and someone else.
I'm helping out as well.
I can try to help out a bit.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so especially if Stephen and Benji are hot in discussion, please, someone feel free to jump in and take notes. The notes end up being incredibly helpful. All right. We don't have a super deep agenda today, so hopefully our meeting is not too long, but each of them I think deserve some pretty in-depth discussion. We're going to look at the last meeting's action items, of course, and see how much progress we made. Spoiler alert, it's only going to be so much. Then we're going to talk about GraphQL scalars, hosting, and how we coordinate those things, GraphQL namespaces. We're going to take a quick look at input union criteria and adjustments that we might want to make to that. And then we can give an update on the last subcommittee that we broke out on input unions and talk a little bit about tag types. Anything else that we want to cover today while we're here that's not on the agenda? All right. With that, let's take a look at the last meeting's action items. This is a thing that I did last night in preparation for this meeting, which I feel like should really do the day after these meetings instead of the day before them. Hopefully this will be an easy thing for us to do to keep us on the hook for following up on action items. I just literally took the notes from the meeting, scanned through for the word action, copy and pasted text, put them in here and put the date at the beginning of them. And I updated all the links in the agendas to show all of the actions, whether they're open or closed. That way it'll be easy to just kind of scan through, look for all the ones that have a particular date in the name, and check to see if they're open or closed. So with that, let's kind of dig through them. I'm going to work on them from the bottom up. The first one was making sure that we have agenda items for the rest of the year. That we now do. We have those through December. And then in another month or two, I'll probably start filing more of them into the beginning part of next year so that we have a clear long-term calendar. Then I have still an open task to take a final editorial pass on the custom Scalar specification. My expectation is still that that will go to final phase. I don't anticipate any problems with that, but I do want to make sure I have some time to take a final look and make any like prose edits before putting that to stage 3 and merging it. So that's still open on me. Introspection shortcuts RFC. This was discussed as a potential stage 1 RFC last meeting, and we decided that it needed a clear problem definition to have a move forward. That I believe is still open. Update the input union RFCs after subcommittee meetings. We mentioned that we needed to do that last meeting after the first of those subcommittee meetings, which we hadn't done, and then we had a second subcommittee meeting. We still haven't captured all of that learning into that doc, so that one's still open. I think any of us that are on the subcommittee can take a stab at that, but that still needs to be done. Adding input union solution criteria that error messages are well specified. Yvonne, this was a good suggestion on you. I explicitly kind of wanted to call this out as a separate bullet from the previous one since it came up separately, but I think likely we'll probably tackle those two at the same time, but that's still pending. And then this last one, I believe I'm gonna be able to mark as completed, including clear problem statements for the Fern stream. That was on Rob, and Rob actually followed up quite quickly and was able to do that a couple of days after the last meeting. So he confirmed that it was done. So I'm gonna close that one. So we still have some open actions from last time, but hopefully this method of filing the action items not too long after we have the meeting by just scanning through our notes will be a good way to make sure that we don't miss stuff. Honestly, we probably should have done that a long time ago, but hey, we're here to get better.
Quick question on the input union subcommittee. I guess since I missed the last few meetings in the spec group, where can I join the subcommittee, and are there any links to it? Because I cannot find one at the top of the RFC.
Subcommittee is maybe giving it too official sounding of a name. It was literally just a quick meeting that we had between the people who championed one of the various proposals in that input unions RFC doc. And so that was Benji, Evan, Vince, and myself. We just got onto a call for a couple of hours and just kind of worked through the document top to bottom to make sure that it was still up to date, made sense, and talked through some space. I have this as a last agenda item for the day because I feel like we could very easily get into the weeds and spend a lot of time discussing it. So I wanted to make sure we have plenty of time for everything else we want to cover today. But I'm happy to give more updates on what we've been up to in those subcommittee meetings.
Cool.
Any other questions on action items? How y'all like this method of filing the tickets afterwards?
I wanted to say I created, it actually was great because I forget about my action item. So I created draft PR with criteria. Format of document input union pretty complex, so there is like some evaluation and scoring. So I will do it after this meeting. But I welcome any feedback on draft RFC.
Awesome. Well, we can jump into it if we can, although we might have to pause on this first agenda item until later because Evan and Andy were gonna lead this one, and I don't think either of them are on the call yet. Is that right? Unless I'm missing something in participants list. Oh, what timing, Evan? You literally joined as I asked whether you were on the call. Welcome.
Thank you. That was just total coincidence, but I'll take it. I know you just hopped on, but do you feel comfortable jumping straight into the discussion on GraphQL Scalars hosting? Yeah, is Andy on the call? I assume
He's not.
Not? Okay. So after, since last time we've shipped the GraphQL Scalar spec change, that's all done and everything now. And Andy created a website, which I think is in the agenda, GraphQLScalars.com, and has created that and posted a simple date time spec, which was the motivating example for that RFC originally. And Andy and I have had a few brief conversations about whether this is something that should live as part of the working group or as part of the official GraphQL spec long-term, whether we want to link out to it as kind of a blessed community location, and what other kind of decisions we want to make around that. Right now, it's very much just Andy's personal website. And I think he's happy to keep doing that for the time being, but I don't know how everybody else feels about the long-term future of this sort of thing.
I think in my mind, the most important kind of philosophical question to answer is, do we want this GraphQL Scalar site to have like a high barrier of entry? Like every Scalar spec on there has been vetted, discussed, and agreed upon as something that everybody should use? Or should this be something that has a pretty low barrier to entry and is purely just about creating a centralized hub? Because I can see trade-offs to either path.
I think we need to, it's like chicken or egg problem. People need to start using with custom scalars, and they wouldn't start using, or it will be like fragmentation of community if we don't give a push. So actually, like one of discussions we had on Slack is that I want to, with Andy, is that I want to use with like custom scalar for daytime in GraphQL.js. So it will push adoption through the ecosystem, hopefully. So like clients and tooling will start using it more. But at the same time, I don't want to depend on some like third-party URL, because it's like kind of, I'm okay. So personally for GraphQL.js case, it's not even a question if it's official or not. It's a question if it's like reliable or not, because like if we depend on some URL and this URL will disappear, we will have the same situation as like we had this situation with GraphQL cuts. So it's like a really extreme situation with Oleg, but like stuff like that happens. Like people lost interest, people like something happens with people. So I don't like, from my point, it's not a question if it's like official or not. It's a question if it's like maintained by foundation or it's maintained outside of foundation.
Courtney, did I see you raise your hand?
Yeah. So I concur with that opinion, and I would suggest that if the community is up for it, then the GraphQL Scalar stuff should probably be hosted in a GitHub repo. I mean, there's less chance of that going away anytime soon, right? So it would probably inspire more confidence, certainly for us to use it, if they were all just in a GitHub repo. And that, I think, also adds, takes away the fragmentation part of it, because if people are submitting their custom scalars into the same repo, then you'd reduce duplication and have a central place where people can just go and look up what's available.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. I think the website that Andy set up is hosted by GitHub Pages. So it's also technically already a GitHub repo. I mean, it's all like custom HTML. So it's not a easy to read GitHub repo, but it does exist in that format.
Yeah, there's a bunch of sort of like technical decisions that we could iterate on if we did decide to take this up. But the reason why I'm asking this line of questioning is kind of how we pose this and how we suggest it to people is important. Like, I don't know if I have a strong personal opinion on this yet, but my sense that it would be more valuable for it to be centralized than it would for it to be blessed, if that makes sense. Blessed is an overloaded word. But like, I don't know that we'd want to say every single spec that you find on GraphQLScalars.com is going to be great and you are not going to have any problems with it. But avoiding a scenario where every single GraphQL scalar is hosted by a different domain seems like a really nice thing to have. Especially if you could do something like an index and you want to be able to say like, what are all the scalars that are out there? You know, having some, like thinking about like, what's the equivalent of NPM, but for GraphQL scalar specs. Like, that's a pretty interesting idea to me. Like, NPM has a really, really powerful effect on the JavaScript community, you know, purely by being a centralized hub.
I guess we would have to think about naming, because I think it would be kind of bad if like bad specs would claim the best names in a way. So I think we will have to allow for duplicating the actual name of the scalar at least.
Yeah, that's a good point. It throws up all of the traditional questions that arise with shared dependency management. Like name collision, are these pages mutable? Like, can someone go and just change the spec? Like, can Andy go update the state time spec and say like, oops, actually it shouldn't have had this clause, or oops, actually it needs this different input interpretation clause. If NPM is an interesting equivalency to draw, in that case you would issue a version breaking change or something like that. We have not baked Semver or anything like that into the custom scalar spec. Probably a good thing, but we might want to consider some way that you can have these while making sure that each snapshot is immutable, so that someone can rely on it and you know that URL is forever.
Reminds me of Golang versioning conventions. Largely, like Golang packages are all URLs and have no versioning built into the URL, but basically you just you shove it in there when you need it, or you give it a new name.
How does that work out? I've not spent much time in Go.
In practice, there's a website that provides like proxy URLs with versions built in that a lot of people end up using. So it kind of.
Oh, that's interesting. The URL and like effectively implements Semver.
Yeah, let me find a example to share in the chat.
One aspect that would make it a lot less painful in regards to name collisions would be if we separate the specification for a scalar from its actual name that has to be used in the schema. So those things just shouldn't be the same.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's already true today, because you say the name of the scalar in your code base and then you say the URL that represents it. So this URL could be completely opaque, arbitrary. You know, it could just be like a hash of the spec and that's the URL, and your GraphQL spec would work equivalently.
Perfect. Cool.
But it's a good point for like searchability and understanding if this ends up being a useful tool over time. then seeing like date dash time, date time with no dash. It's like people are gonna have competing implementations of these things.
I actually think we can have sequential numbers like RFC. So it's way simpler, and it's all like for small changes, like editorial changes. And it's not like a names. And people are okay that standards have numbers. So like if somebody get like lucky number, it's like a good thing, but it's not critical. Also, from RFC process, at one point I actually wanted to make my own RFC, so I researched it a little bit. So they have like types of RFC. So there is like, I think it's type number 4 called informal. So criteria for that is that you send it to editor from like some organization, and they just check your grammar and like spelling, grammar, and other stuff. And if it's correct, they publish it. So they don't have any like anything to say about content. It's just like formatting and proper style and like technical document. So like stuff about technical documentation. So I think we can actually have like types of RFC and show it inside the URL. So like Scalar / like experimental or / like I don't know, accepted, adopted STD standard and number. I think sequential number is better than hash.
Yeah, sequential numbers is probably better than hash in terms of understandability. And thanks for the link to the Go package thing. That's very interesting. I can imagine how a URL proxy pattern would just the most recent iteration is what's supplied by that URL. It's not exactly immutable by that sense, but it's an interesting way to kind of blur the line between URL immutability and Semver logic.
Yeah, and
Dino seems to do the same thing, so it's pretty popular.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it has some logic around like GitHub Git tags and stuff. So if you have certain branches with Semver-like names, then it will point to the right one, or at least try to.
So what open questions are there? What do we need to decide in this committee, or is this just fact finding?
I mean, I think it sounds like there's kind of an appetite to take this under the GraphQL Foundation umbrella in some sense to ensure stability at least. But I don't know if there's anybody who has the time and interest to actually do that, or if we should just let Andy run his personal site for a while, because there's kind of needs to be somebody who has the access and time to do that migration and build that part of the official GraphQL Foundation side of things.
Yeah, so we have discussion with Andy, and as I understand, he's open to idea, but he don't want a lot of bureaucracy. He don't want to spend time like on reviews and official procedures. So like, if we say it's unofficial, it's like just sequential number, and like you need to just properly format your document. I think I can do the open. I cannot speak for him, but at least from the conversation.
Yeah, this is the heart of the discussion, I think. Evan, I agree with you. I think there's appetite for the project to be a foundation project, and therefore, be granted some longevity. And if Andy decides that he wants to be busy with something else, then we can figure out how to make sure that that thing has a long life. But each particular document, to Yvonne's point, should like probably default to this informal style or something. So, maybe the right next piece is to figure out how do we remove even more from from even more, hurdles to jump, barriers to cross. Like, do you even need to get a pull request merged? Like, what's the pathway you needed to follow in order to get something in there? And then how do we answer questions like, when people disagree about a scalar, can we just allow them to disagree and then have a way to make that super clear? Like, I'm watching NPM starting to push people towards really encouraging including the org or username as part of the package. You have the @ / your package name. Do we just want to start with that convention, and you just kind of know, like, Andy's datetime scalar here just becomes graphqlscalars.com /@Andy/datetime/v1 or something like that, and then everyone can have their own, and we can just throw a Galia search on top of it or something. Go ahead, Benedict.
I think this whole thing is not quite big enough to build up like a whole new service around it. So it's not like we're gonna build a new NPM for GraphQL scalars. I think an easy way would be to take advantage of GitHub as an ecosystem and utilize the code owners files to just put it all in one repository, make subdirectories for each scalar, and then a selected list of people can be part of the code owners, and they can do whatever they want in this part. And we can have some rules around like disallowing force pushes, for example, so the versions stay immutable.
I think we're still missing the question then of like who organizes all of this and sets this up and maintains it, because Andy doesn't really want to from the sounds of things, and I don't have the time. And I think from a there seems to be two questions here. One of them is what's the word I'm looking for? Survivability? Not quite that, but just like confidence that whatever URL we end up using for these things is not going to go away because Andy decides to stop paying for the domain name. And I think like that is at least as easily solvable as just having that domain name transferred to the foundation, so that we can ensure that it at least stays up. Then the second question is like, what's the longer term framework we want for all of that, which seems like a lot more work, and like I've heard a lot of good ideas, but we still need somebody to do that work.
And another point is that for the most part, the GraphQL Foundation is served by volunteers, and unless we can dedicate people to maintaining this, I fear that it will be too slow and therefore less attractive to the public.
Totally agree. Go ahead, Courtney.
So if we defined a clear list of things that needed to happen to get this into the repository, etc., I could get someone from our team to do some of that work, because we've been creating a bunch of scalars in our platform, so this is something that we would be keen to get going as well. So we could schedule that just in our usual sprints, and have somebody from the team do some of that work. It just depends on how much work there is, and if I could work out a clear list of tasks that I could give to people to do, I could get someone to do it from our team.
Nice. This is kind of why I was asking about, what do we want the mechanism to be for people to submit stuff? Because I just anticipate an outcome where there's like a bunch of pull requests up to add new scalars, and nobody's there to review them, and that would be a sad fate. And Gabe, you're right to point out that the foundation is more of a legal structure than a technical structure, right? Like we're there to play safe harbor for IP, but ultimately it's all of us, showing up from our various institutions that are going to work together on something like this. I do think that if we made it really clear what needed to be built, and kind of put that together as a spec and said like, hey, here's what we have, but like, here's the gap between that and what we want. And then asked if anybody was interested in such a project beyond just this working group. You know, we could like tweet it out or something, or just go ask our respective teams. I would not be surprised if we found some volunteers to help make that happen.
I have suggestion. First thing, I think we need to involve Andy in this conversation, because he kind of, because he created this thing, and do we want to adopt it? Do we want to do something in parallel? And like, so, and another thing, I think like it will be easier to find people who just can like work in algorithm. It's harder to write some like basic algorithm. And I don't think we need to overcomplicate it and think about all possible situations. For example, in this working group, we don't like, it's already 3 years, and we don't have like rights about voting or about seats, and everything work more or less normal. So we don't need to formalize too early. So I would suggest one thing: can we schedule a call, discuss like with Andy when he have a time, and schedule like 1 hour, maybe hour and a half, and actually discuss these rules and write them. I think it would be enough time to do that.
Yeah, I can kind of go to that. Who else would be interested in being part of that conversation?
Yeah, me.
I'm happy to join if the timing works out.
I'll jump on that
Also,
as well.
Awesome. We can also start that conversation async in the Slack channel.
Yeah, I'll start it there, and we'll see what happens.
In the main Slack channel? Which Slack channel?
Working group WG channel.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Let's move on. Courtney, I'll hand it to you to talk about namespaces.
Okay. Can I share my screen? So I have been hastily putting my notes into a slide while I've been on the call. So is everyone familiar with the namespaces thread that's been going for a while now?
A high-level overview would be nice.
Okay. So there was a ticket created some time ago asking whether namespaces could be added to the GraphQL spec. And various suggestions have been put forward on the syntax that could be used, as well as why it should be added in the first place. I can't remember how many different versions people have suggested and different ways that they've suggested of doing it. The one thing that's clear, I think, from just reading that issue is that it's really contentious. So in this, what I'm going to try and do is not really argue for any particular syntax, but for the usefulness of namespaces in particular, and how that comes to fruition later, if it does get included, is for another discussion, I think. So again, I can't speak for other people, but I will try to use the use case that we have at Hippie and try to highlight why I think it would make things a lot better for us. So Hippie is a platform that allows developers to create basically virtual apps. So you give our platform a GraphQL definition of the models that you would like, and it then generates a GraphQL and a REST API for you from those. The thing that's starting to become a problem is that we have the ability, just like you do in NPM and other package management systems, for you to have dependencies between apps. And these dependencies aren't just from your team or from your organization, but other people using the platform can share their apps that they've created, and therefore the types that they have made available also becomes available in your app. At the moment, we're doing a bunch of hacks to try and avoid name collisions. And the suggestion is that adding namespaces would actually help make this a lot simpler for our customers. The argument that has been given a couple of times is that you can achieve the same thing by prefixing or even suffixing type with whatever you would use for a namespace. And that argument is perfectly valid. In a lot of cases, you can do that to achieve almost equivalence. The problem starts for us when we have in our setup, every organization has a realm. So you would have a realm name, and these realms can then have apps inside them, and each app can have one or more releases. So in order for us to know that type is unique, we would have to use all three of those components as a prefix or a suffix to every type, which again, for a lot of cases, isn't the end of the world. You can do that. The types will become a bit long, but it's not the end of the world. Where it starts to become a problem, and 1 second, just jump through these, is when you start to do a lot more automated stuff, as we're doing in our platform. In some cases, we're allowing dependencies, like I said, which brings in stuff from different versions. Even from the same app, you can have a dependency between different versions that would bring in other types. So you start to get conflicts even in the same app. The bigger problem for us is that the people that are sharing some of these apps don't know each other. There's no way for them to coordinate and say, I'm going to call my type this, or I'm going to use a short enough prefix in the type names, or for the type names, which means that you start ending up with really, really long type names. And it's okay if this was for example, the JavaScript or the Java clients that would generate this stuff automatically. But quite a few of our customers are doing a lot of GraphQL introspection and then dynamically working with what comes back. In some cases, they know some of the types that they're expecting, so then they have to actually start typing some of this stuff out. And because we're generating the type names and the function names, it starts to become very unreadable. So if you look at the introspection results from some of our APIs that have a bunch of apps included, the generated names, you can't even see the full signature in graphical in some cases, and it makes it really hard to work with. So that would be the first thing that I think is a pain point for us. So it doesn't make things impossible, but it's ridiculously painful to work with in some cases. The next part of this is away from the name resolution thing. We include authorization capabilities in the platform, and in order to so what we do is if you add, for example, a function called, not a function, but in the query type, if you have a field called XYZ, you can create a scope-based permission that would let you protect query.xyz. This starts to become a real problem because the more apps you inherit, you end up with an explosion of these types and an explosion of these scopes. You then have to basically create these catch-all authorization policies to try and capture all of the cases that are coming in from apps that you're depending on. That makes the authorization policies very brittle. It's either you do that or you write something that then generates individual authorization policies, but that again is not really maintainable by hand. You have to automate all of it. And not all of our customers have the capability to be able to write something that would automate all of that. So that's the other thing. That's just away from the, you could get the equivalent behavior by prefixing or suffixing. In our case as well, the example that I've just given is relatively okay. So Facebook, WhatsApp, message, it's not very long, but you have some companies who would use a longer prefix for their own name, for example. And then you literally get something that's going off the screen if you're looking at a 120 or a 180 view of things. The names that are being generated are just completely unreadable. That's as much as I think I can argue for this. It's the same argument that you would use for namespaces in any modern language that has namespaces. I wasn't really prepared to do this. I put this together just as we started doing this call. But those are the examples and the use cases that I could think of. And in our case, for most of our customers, they don't get the full benefit of the GraphQL ecosystem. So they don't have the tools to be able to do the generate stuff, because again, like I said, some of the stuff that they're doing is happening by just doing introspection and then some combination of stuff that they can't take full advantage of the compile time or statically generated stuff that you might do if you were to use the generators from the rest of the ecosystem. So I think I just talked about all of that without going to this slide. That's really all I had to say on the matter. I gave an example of what we implemented to try and see what it would take to make this work. In the ticket, so I think it was about a year ago, if not more, Lee suggested that one of the things that we could do is just to implement it, see what it would take to implement it, and then report back. And I posted a long comment on what we'd implemented. And what we did do was something that was similar to namespaces in C++. So you do namespace, you give it a name, and then all the names that, all the definitions that come after that are in that namespace. And there were no major challenges in getting this implemented. In fact, we used GraphQL Java library, and I think the modifications took about 2 days for the developer to start actually playing around with it. So implementation wise, it wasn't a huge burden. What became a real problem was after we got a few customers to try and use it, they completely lost all the GraphQL ecosystem, right? So what little they do have through our platform just evaporated because there's no support for namespaces in any of the libraries that they were using, like Apollo, etc. So everything just went, yeah, no, which became a real problem for them. So we haven't rolled this out, but I do think that it makes life a lot easier for our customers. And I can't think of any other examples than what I've given. And I do think there is real benefit, not just for us as the providers, but for our customers, especially for our customers, in adding namespaces. That's it.
Who did the demo implementation? Was that in GraphQL JS?
No, it was in Java.
In Java.
Yeah. So we modified GraphQL Java to do the implementation that we ended up with.
Cool, that makes sense. Yeah, most of my concerns I remember from a previous comment were not necessarily complications in the SDL. I think most of the time when people talk about this, they talk about it in terms of the SDL, and it's relatively straightforward to imagine some SDL syntax that you might use, but not everyone uses GraphQL via the SDL. A lot of them use it via a code library or via introspection, and in those cases, that's most of where my complexity concern comes from. Is in those cases, it's far less clear, you know, what happens to existing clients that don't know about namespaces, what default namespace lookup looks like is there an algorithm for that? There's namespaces are not a simple thing across other languages.
Yeah, so in the comment that I posted, I addressed some of those, including a simple algorithm for how you could do default namespaces to try and maintain backwards compatibility. In the syntax that I showed in the example, the way we'd done it was so that you could optionally have the namespace. If it was missing, then stuff goes into a default namespace. And that ensured that existing SDL schemas didn't need to change if the parser didn't support it. So if you just didn't have namespaces, it would just be as if it doesn't exist. And for the most part, I'd need to double check this to confirm, but I'm sure that none of the customers that we had try it had to change their existing schemas to actually start using the new version. In fact, I'm 100% sure because this is turned on from my account, and I did a demo on my account 2 days ago, and there were no issues. I didn't use namespaces, but the version that has namespaces on the server was running, so it was enabled from my account. And I totally forgot namespaces was there, so I just use it as if it wasn't.
Anyone else have thoughts or comments?
I'll add my 2 cents in terms of like namespaces would also be useful for us as Shopify's schema has gotten very, very large internally. Like prefixing has worked for us as a workaround or as kind of the available option right now. But first class support would be nice. It's not the most important thing facing us right at this moment with GraphQL, but it would definitely be a nice to have.
Can you describe the reason for the issue?
Was that for me or Evan?
Oh.
We have, our schema is enormous internally right now. I mean, our public schema is pretty big too, but we have a great deal more of it that's private. And just in terms of keeping names distinct when they refer to similar things across different parts of the company and different parts of our technical stack, we end up with kind of changed names, prefix names like online store, blah, 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 blah page. You know, like the classic, whatever, Java factory instance builder thing. I don't remember what that example was, but I think people know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And like it works, and we have tooling that deals with long names reasonably well, so it's not a huge problem for us, but it's definitely awkward, and proper name spacing would make it nicer.
Thank you.
I just want to say that at TakeShape, we have user-defined schemas. And so we run into a similar issue, and we're currently working around it with prefixing. So just more of a +1 comment for namespaces.
I know a lot of other languages that have namespaces are nested or recursive. Is that also something that we see? Like Evan, you mentioned that you have like multiple kind of prefixes that qualify where a type is used. Would you expect that being translated to like a dot path of namespaces?
Yeah, that would be nice. I think in practice, we mostly only have, like if we were to translate our current schema into namespaces, we'd I think have at most 2 or 3 layers of name. Like it wouldn't be super deep at the moment, but definitely we have cases that are there's more than 1 layer right now.
For us, that's the same. So there are at least 3 layers because we have to use the customer's realm name, the name of their app, and the name of the release as a prefix to get unique types. So it would be 3, but we're having to use all of them at the moment where we are doing that.
Oh, you would change the name of a type based on a release? Would that be a breaking change?
It would be a breaking change. The problem isn't so much for the breaking change, but because of, for us, the fact that you can have dependencies with other apps, that it's the collision from other releases or potentially other type apps that creates the problem.
I see. Honestly, this is the most interesting. I I think this came up in the thread long in the past, but most of the original motivations for namespaces that honestly I was really underwhelmed by was this idea that different parts of a company wanted to isolate themselves from each other and think about schema design in a distributed fashion. I can't see that leading anywhere other than total disaster, and like with the schema that just doesn't make sense for the people who have to use it. And given that GraphQL is designed not for schema builders, but for schema users, we should do the thing that works best for them. But this other use case I think is way more interesting and compelling, which is like a truly distributed schema where it's not just that they're different parts of the company that want to be able to determine if they're isolated or not, but they're like different companies or different organizations or whatever, where you could kind of start to evolve this intermeshed, interleaved schema. That's an interesting direction to me. And certainly, you know, if you wanted to build something where you're tying GitHub's API with Shopify's API with some other API together, namespaces might be an interesting way to make sense of that world.
So we actually have a functionality that allows customers to do exactly that. So one of the features that you can use is when you create an app, you can specify an open API specification, and we'll automatically generate type definitions and methods, so queries and mutations from those. And for customers that are basically using us and our GraphQL API as a gateway to these APIs, you end up with an explosion of types. Obviously, if you take this Stripe API, it's humongous, right? Just loading the YAML in Chrome causes it to freeze for a couple of seconds. And imagine having, say, 2 or 3 more of these that you're depending on. You just end up with an explosion of these types, and it makes it really unusable in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to share some idea because it's actually not a new problem. And we discussed it with Prisma guys. They experienced it like years ago. And they after this package called GraphQL import, it's basically allow you to, they use a comment syntax because we don't have top-level directives yet. We discussed it, but nobody championing it. So instead they used comments, and basically it's like import and type name from, and we discussed with them, they didn't implement it, but we discussed with them that you can also add custom prefix. So like in JavaScript, you do import something as something, and it's basically solve like entire problem. For GraphQL, it's a little bit more complex because types can depend on other types. So you cannot just rename type which you import because it will bring other types inside, but you can provide custom prefix. So I think like for a case where you imported like small number of third-party types, we can just allow people to do custom prefixes, not after generate prefixes for them. Like, and if you after generate prefixes, would be long. But if customer can provide prefix for importing type, it can be pretty short, and it can be like every customer can choose whatever prefix they want inside the SDL. So I give some example inside comments if somebody interested.
Yeah. So in the comment that I posted on that issue, we'd actually implemented support for aliases and partial imports. So I just mentioned the open API examples that's available in the platform. We added support so that you could do import from namespace and specify the types that you want imported. So you didn't have to import the entire Stripe API, but also added support for doing import namespace.type as some other type name to address the point you just raised. So we implemented that in the version that we did for this trial as well.
Yeah, I just suggested one more thing. Instead of like importing namespaces, allow people to create their own prefixes. So like instead of like just specify what you want, you specify what you want plus custom prefix.
Did we lose Lee?
Yeah, it looks like Lee just dropped from the call.
My internet. Hopefully that didn't totally disrupt everything.
Only a little. You back?
Yeah, I'm back. I think so. I just called in from my phone. Yeah, sorry for that. Where were we?
So Ivana just suggested allowing the specification for your own prefix, but I'd have to defer to him to try and explain it again to you.
That's okay. I can follow up on the notes for what I missed. I just want to make sure that we didn't lose track of where we were in the meeting.
No. So I mean, from our perspective, I guess figuring out whether the GraphQL community wants to take this forward is one thing, but also if we needed to do anything, because we're quite keen to get this in. So if that meant writing the RFC or something else, or if there was strong opposition to it or whatever, having I guess some action items for where to go, how to go forward, I think is the thing that the main reason I'm on this call today. So what from me would be useful is is there any strong reason not to have this? And if there is, can whoever has those oppositions explain that? If it's okay and it's something that's the community is open to exploring beyond that issue, what's the next step? Is that an RFC? And I guess, yeah, that's it. What's the next step? What do we do for this going forward?
I mean, personally, I'm still concerned that it adds a layer of complexity, and there are some reasonable workarounds, even though they have downsides. So I think a worthwhile next step would be a clearly stated RFC, which documents the problem kind of as you posed it here, explains why the existing solutions are inadequate to solve that problem, explains why this problem is widespread enough that it warrants addition to the spec, and then starting to outline the exact shape of that solution. And capturing.
Lee, could you say those things a little slower? I can't keep up with you.
Oh man, I'm sorry. Yes, the basic shape of RFC, problem statement, then sort of like size of problem statement, right? So how likely is it that the typical GraphQL user will use this? So put another way, what I want to avoid is GraphQL having a ton of fringe features which are used by very few members of the community, but accumulate to quite a large amount of complexity and sort of things that you have to learn in order to understand what's going on with GraphQL. So, you know, usually the first phases of RFCs is mostly about making a problem statement very clear, making it clear that the existing solutions are inadequate to solve that problem, and making it clear that a solution to such a problem is in the net benefit to the majority of people who use GraphQL. Then that's usually makes a clear argument for adding additional complexity to the system and the language and the spec. Then there's all the practical questions of backwards compatibility. You know, are there degenerate cases? What are scenarios where you can break a schema? There's like lots of those things are typically what come up when we're talking about stage 1 or stage 2 RFCs. Or what are all the various ways that this can bite us? What are all the various flip guns we're introducing? And making sure that we're addressing those things.
Yeah, as far as making a case for the value and the first step of that, I think like the use cases you've presented here today are a good first step towards that. They just need, you know, cleaning up and writing down and presenting in a way that's going to work for posterity, basically.
Okay, cool.
But it sounds like where we are is there's certainly, I mean, I would say the opposition that you'll hear will be about caution and not about rejection, which means the right next step is to charge forward and start to clarify that caution and make it clear that each piece is either unwarranted or able to be mitigated. And that'll make a clear path forward for making this happen.
Sweet. All right, I'll do that.
Awesome.
Yeah, so
Cool.
Some notes, because I'm, as Lee said, I'm concerned about that. So, but at the same time, I'm totally for exploring that, because it's not the first time we discuss it. Like even on working group, we discussed it a couple of times. So we need to formalize this discussion and to really go deep. At some point, we need to do something to address this. Even explaining what concern we have is also important. One thing, so like for me personally, I'm like, I don't have GraphQL API and I don't use GraphQL API. I might have two concerns from implementer side and from tooling. So maybe they're pretty specific, but tooling is pretty important in GraphQL ecosystem. So from implementer's point of view, what will help me if you can share like your fork or in some other way to show how much changes it involved for GraphQL Java. So like, is it like you change 100 lines or is it like a couple thousand lines? Because one of the things we have like complexity budget. Every feature that we add into GraphQL package will be implemented in all the languages. So I'm interested to see like the size of the changes, not particular changes, but like just like a size. So it would be great if you can share it somewhere.
So we had a fork of GraphQL Java that we were maintaining internally anyway. I will get someone to basically try and extract all those changes because they should be in isolated commits somewhere. And then I'll do a copy of this publicly so that I can share it.
Yeah, it would be great.
Nice. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about input unions. I think there's a ton of stuff to get through here, and we can spend the remainder of our meeting on input unions. Benedict, I sorted your bit to the top just to make sure that you had an opportunity to kind of speak to this constraint that you wanted to add on the problem. So I don't know if you need the full 20 minutes to talk about that, knowing that we're going to talk about input unions beyond that, but I wanted to kind of leave it to you first.
Right, so The reason why I brought this up as part of this discussion today is that there was relatively little feedback on the PR. And so I assume not everyone has seen it, or otherwise there would have been more feedback. But it's about this this criteria that I added. That's mainly about developer ergonomics of input unions. So one issue I've seen with some of the suggested solutions is that it makes it really hard to freely combine different input types to an input union. And they place some constraints on which input types can be combined in the first place, or how they have to be composed in order to be able to be combined. And yeah, I've just gotten around to articulate that. I had a gut feeling about that it was kind of bad with some of these solutions.
Yeah, I merged your pull request because it actually matched really well a discussion that the few of us that went deep on input unions had. It ultimately led us to decide that at a minimum, we're ruling out that option number 4. And I think actually the reason that we ruled it out was almost exactly for this constraint that you're suggesting. We kind of found ourselves there, but had a difficult time articulating exactly what that looked like. But if I can recap the discussion, and Vince or Evan or Benji, feel free to jump in and correct me. One of the things that we thought about was, what does schema evolution look like with any of these things? What does it look like to add an additional type to the union? Or what does it look like if you add a field to an existing input type? And for 4 in particular, where the constraint is that each type in the union needed to be structurally unique, then you could end up in a bunch of really bad scenarios where what looks like a very non-breaking addition of a field to an existing input object therefore causes that structural uniqueness guarantee to be lost, and therefore makes it a breaking change. And then similarly, introducing a new input type to a union could have a similar effect. And that we felt kind of boxed you into way too many corners. It would make it so that, like, once you had defined an input union with some input types involved, it would make both those types and the input union itself pretty tough to evolve from that point forward. And that was reason enough to disqualify it. I think that lines up very well with what you're talking about, but make sure I'm not misunderstanding your constraint, Benedict.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, another example I came up with that is really hard with solutions 2, 3, and 4 is reuse of a single input type as part of multiple union types, because each of those solutions places some constraint on what fields might be in there. And while those might be designed in a way that they work nicely in one specific input union, it might fall apart pretty quickly once you try to add them to multiple input unions. And you might find yourself in a spot where you have to prefix all your types or something, or all the fields in the input union, or possibly duplicate inputs just so that you can combine them.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like those kinds of constraints are much worse in the long run than possibly some complexity that the other solutions have. They don't feel as nice at first, but I think overall it will be much more clean.
Yeah, 4 in particular is very seriously affected by this, to a degree. Although my expectation is that people would use those field constraints kind of globally rather than in each type. So in practice, it might have a slightly less serious effect than 4. 3, it it could potentially have an effect, but kind of the way that the algorithm works for 3, I think probably works around that. But we also kind of agreed, another thing that came up in the subcommittee meeting was 3 as it's posed right now is not enough. So we're actually in the process of combining aspects of solution 1 and solution 3 together as like a solution 6 in this list that in part actually specifically to get ahead of this problem. But Benji, Evan, Vince, let me know if there's other pieces to this discussion that I'm missing.
One aspect about 3 that is not really a part of any criteria so far, but I think it the way the algorithm works kind of always has a way to determine a match, sure, but I really don't like the way that it's fuzzy in a way. So, and I think that most of the time that's absolutely not what you want, to have your inputs somewhat interpreted by the backend. So that could lead to some really, really nasty bugs.
Yep, this is related. Yvonne brought up a similar criteria that we should add last meeting about making error messages predictable. And I see these being very related constraints, that if it's difficult to know how the backend is going to interpret some input, it means it's also difficult to know what the appropriate error response would be in the case of failure. But this is a good segue into the rest of the discussion. I've been talking too much, so Benji, the tag types was sort of your foray in. Do you want to give an update about the last subcommittee meeting and sort of the bulk of our discussion?
Sure, I'll do my best. So as Lee said already, we have spent some time discussing all of the existing solutions. We've managed to pretty much rule out solution 4 for now. This solution 6 that we've been discussing was sort of a combination of solutions 1, 2, and 3, and we've gone backwards and forwards on a few different parts of that. Found the issues where it relates to evolving the schema, for example, or ambiguity of input, or whether it is the client or the server that gets to decide what the resolution of a type is. We also talked about things like the nested complexity that could be introduced if you're not specifying a type explicitly. If you have a tree-like structure, for example, then you can get this sort of combinatorics issue where to determine exhaustively whether you've got the right type, you actually need to check each type at each level. And if you've got an object tree that's maybe just 4 different options and 4 layers deep, that's already 16 possibilities before you know that it's exhaustively none of them and you should raise an error. So there were some various issues like that. And basically, I think, Lee, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think what it came down to was the difference between nominative typing, as in saying it is explicitly this thing, versus a more structural typing where you just sort of say, I have a thing, it has a name and it has an age, store it as whatever you want, backend. And the structural typing is very flexible, but that flexibility does come with the cost of, it's like very nice for users to use, but it's actually a lot harder for the back end to implement. And rather than being, say, O1, it can become ON or maybe ON squared or possibly even worse. So that's kind of the things that we were sort of discussing. So we looked at the solutions that we had, and solution 5, which is the one-of directive as it was previously raised, we looked into that a bit more. So one of the issues with the, I tell you what, I'll share this this gist. yeah, into the chat. So in chat, I've just shared a gist, which is me experimenting with the one-of directive approach. Now, I always sort of said I didn't really care how it was exposed over the SDL. I made it as a one-off directive because it was a very easy way to just take an existing input and go, and now it just accepts one field. But syntactically in the SDL, you could express it as a large number of different syntaxes. And we looked at what some of those meant. Well, they're effectively equivalent, but we looked at what they are and what they imply about what's going on. We also talked, and this is relevant to an earlier discussion we had today, about what the exception handling, no, sorry, it was an issue I reviewed today, what the exception handling is for the nullability. So where would the error be thrown? Because effectively we're introducing this intermediary layer. So rather than having an object that inherently has its type inside of it, we're using a tag on the outside to say the thing is going to be of this type. So now we're 2 layers deep rather than just 1 layer. So what happens if, say, you had an ID field on that said it was non-nullable, but gave a null and we threw an error? Would the error be thrown at that field level within the tagged union, or would it be thrown at the parent level where the tagged union was referenced? And things get more interesting there. So what we've effectively considered at the moment is that just doing this as a directive, as a tag on an existing input type is maybe not the right direction to go. There's too many exceptions to it. There's things like it does not have arguments. It will never have arguments. It may or may not have support for directives. That's not quite clear yet on the individual entries inside the tag. It has custom handling of nullability, and maybe we need to expose that in an explicit way. How we handle that nullability, it would be great to be able to reuse our existing nullability and error handling as the errors cascade through the tree. So if we can define it in such a way where we can reuse those things, that would be great. So what we're thinking at the moment is take the concept that we've got of this one-of, rename it. It's going to be called something like tagged unions or something like that. We're not sure exactly yet. And then give it a concrete new type in the GraphQL schema rather than just reusing the input type. And one of the interesting things that this allows us to do as well is expand what it means potentially to output types as well. So certain systems may already be in a shape where exposing it as a tagged output union may actually be a better way of doing things than the existing unions. Lee raised an interesting part of GraphQL history, which is that actually when they were implementing unions originally, this shape was actually considered for a fair while before we took the union approach. And there's certain things that the tagged approach doesn't allow so easily. So for example, spreading on a named type is more challenging because you have to do it within a field rather than say over all the things that implement this particular interface. Then, you know, whether it be cat, dog, or giraffe, they all implement the animal interface. So you could do a fragment spread on animal within a union of a bunch of other types, and that would work. But with a tagged union approach, that wouldn't work. That said, it does have other advantages. So what we've ended up with there is that I will be writing up the RFC again, effectively. Previously, I wrote it up as a small modification to input. This time I'm going to write it up as a full implementation of a new type within the GraphQL type system. And we're going to evaluate it against all of our different use cases, see if we can find the problems, see how complex it's going to be to implement, and what it means for everything else. So yeah, I think that's broadly a summary of that 2 or 3 hour phone call. Does anyone have any questions?
One thing that's exciting to me about this direction is I think a point that came up a lot as we've been discussing input unions is whether we want to look for symmetries between the input and output type spaces, and the existing all the previous input unions like do their best to try to be a symmetry of the output union type, but they kind of all just necessarily have to work in really different ways. And I think that's part of why we've been really underwhelmed with all of them. Each one of them kind of bumps up against one of these criteria in a really unsatisfying way. And what's kind of really exciting about a tagged type is because it's a new type, there's a little bit more room for us to set expectations from the get-go and then end up with something that could potentially work in both input and output scenarios, or both in some cases, which I think it could be a really, really nice thing for this direction if it works out that way. But yeah, what questions do folks have about this path?
I think it's simple possible we can go. One thing, like on one hand, I'm like kind of interested in complicating it more. On the other hand, I like that it's super simple. It's like, you know, the same questions that everybody has, why it's not only one field, why it's not like a couple groups of fields competing with each other. So I think it would be great if you also include, like, you probably discuss it and you have like argument why it's only one field and not like groups of fields. I saw some discussion inside the issues. So like, I think it would be great if you include some frequently asked questions and answers about making it more complex, because I'm constantly thinking myself like, yeah, it kind of would be great if we can represent like a date as a string and date as day, month, and year. And I have one group of field where one field value or string date when it's like date, and other fields when it's breaking. So it's like groups of fields, it's things that people natively will ask. So it would be great if you address why it's not possible in your document or your RFC.
Yeah, interesting point, Ivan. I've thought about this a lot, and in particular, I've brought this up a few times. I'm interested in not just the input types and the output types, but also field arguments, which is like a completely different thing, but also very much the same as input objects. So I'm interested to see where it could potentially go there. But we fortunately separated that to a separate RFC that will get rejected late. I mean, applied later. But yes, so I think broadly with like the example that you raised for dates, I think what we would do in that case is have another input object that represents these separate parts and then reference that as a one field. But there is value in addressing that. And basically, I think the answer comes down to it's unnecessarily complex to try and deal with this idea of having multiple groups of things. That said, if we were able to expand it to arguments, then it could become more valuable, because that's something that is very commonly needed in arguments. But you know, we'll have a look. This is still very much in the thought process, so I've got to write it up formally and then try and analyze all of the different solutions against it, and I haven't sadly had enough time yet.
Yeah, I have one additional argument why it's like problematic, and you can apply it to other input union proposals. It's about after completion. When people like after completion is big part of GraphQL success in a sense. And if we have to complete one field, it's like natural flow when you develop a query. But if it's group of fields. So like after completion experiences became really weird. So like one of have a trade-off of moving everything to the right, but after completion flow is undisturbed.
That's interesting. I actually I really like that point that we should kind of discuss impact on tooling. Yeah, autocomplete has become such an important part of graphical and other tools that making sure that that experience continues to feel fluid is an important sign of potential success or failure of a proposal.
It's also, so I hear what you're saying with the auto-completion of the single versus many fields, but moving on to another auto-completion, the whole tagged union approach is easier to autocomplete than doing fragment spreads, for example. It involves the user needing to know a lot less things. It's easier for tools like Graphical Explorer, for example, to just like check the checkbox on that field and now you get access to this tree. So I think it should, the tagged unions, I think, will be very easy and nice for beginners to use. Though I think one of the big things that I'm going to have to answer whilst writing this RFC is rules on when should you use a tagged union versus when should you use the existing union type that we have in GraphQL. And I think that's going to be a fun question for me to try and answer.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I recall us talking about, and it was more of a future-facing thing, but when it comes to thinking about symmetry between input and output with the tagged union, since it's a new structure and not trying to squeeze into existing things, we had the option of considering something in the future like an additional new type, perhaps called a struct, which would have features such that it could be used both in inputs and in outputs as is, which wouldn't require necessarily a different input type and a different output type. You would have to restrict things like it can't have arguments, some other details, but that is, with this tagged union approach, like that is a possible future which could bring some real benefits and is quite an interesting avenue. So that was something that I think is also exciting about this potential solution.
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea of structs is effectively you can allow the existing scalars, which work both as input and output, and the structs themselves, which work as input and output, and have that work throughout the whole tree potentially. But what it would do is break from our existing input and output types. It would be a whole kind of separate domain almost. So it is interesting. But it prevents us from doing things like field relations for like taking a user and then finding their friends, for example, and paginating over that and limiting that in particular ways. Or if we support that somehow, there's a lot of complexity there because there wouldn't be the mirrored input type. So it is definitely an interesting thing. But I think what I'm planning to write up at the moment would be based on our existing input and output types and keeping things very similar to those rather than introducing the concept of structs.
Yeah, I think that's wise. It's one of those categories of things like changes we make now don't inhibit that from happening in the future. So we can consider it in the future. We don't have to include it now for sure.
Have you thought about what the migration path might look like for users who currently use regular union types and want to use this one-off or tagged union approach to send back the things they received from a union?
That's a great question. So currently, no. I have thought about it previously with the previous version of the tagged union, and the migration path was really easy. But for assuming that you already build things in that pattern. But when it comes to the new form, no, sorry, that was not fair. If you already have tagged unions in your schema, then you could convert them over to the new, directive approach tagged unions very easily, and it would just be effectively stronger validation of what you already have. It would technically be a breaking change, but if you already have your resolvers enforcing that logic, then it would just be moving the resolution from the resolver to the schema. So broadly, it would be unbreaking. That said, the idea of moving something that already accepts exactly one input type and then taking that input and making it part of a union requires now that there would be a tag. So you'd have to effectively push it to the right and put a tag there. So I'm not sure that there's going to be an easy way of supporting that. At the moment, I think it's probably just going to have to be a new field and deprecate the old field, which is unfortunate, but it's definitely something I'll give thought, because that was one of the main things I wanted to support was existing usages of tagged types.
Yeah, I think actually the migration path is, as you've mentioned, there might already be users who actually implement tagged unions, just not with the strong validation. So for some it might not change anything and just validate what they've done before. And whereas on the other hand, the approaches that introduce an additional discriminator field, nothing like that really exists formally.
That's right. Yeah. The tagged union pattern is already pretty common for inputs where you want an input union. And that's part of, I think, the motivation for this path is looking out to existing schema and seeing, for people who want this feature, what are they already doing? And the tagged union pattern is somewhat pervasive. But there's actually two different migration paths that are completely incompatible with each other. And so we just have to pick one. One of them is looking for existing uses of unions and seeing what people are doing and then finding a way to help them in. And that's a case that's a vote in favor of something like a tagged union or a one of, because that's a common pattern. The other is a field that, or an input that currently is not yet a union, but would like to become a union. So it's going from a single input and then wants to become multiple inputs. So maybe it previously took a string and now you want it to take a string or an object. Some of the other proposals make that a potentially non-breaking change. And this would not provide a non-breaking change for that path. You'd have to provide a different shape to your input to allow that to happen. So, there's trade-offs there. And I think it's kind of similarly for outputs. There's no clear path for how you would convert. Like if you decided that your typical union is actually better modeled as a tag type, there's no path for doing that without introducing a new field and deprecating your old one. But that might be okay. I think we just have to kind of document these cases. It's always good in these RFCs to be honest about the downsides.
Yeah, the same can be true from if you like take things away from your input union until you're at the point where you have a single type again, and then it's kind of like, oh, so now your schema is unnecessarily complex, and you might want to bring it back a level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this doesn't account for that going from one to many, going from like many to even more many. Like that works. Going from existing informal tagged unions to formalized tag unions, that's going to work really well. Going from one thing to many things, I think that's a breaking path. If you do it directly, you got to find a way to do it via introducing a new thing and deprecating the old thing, which that's like, I think it's inevitable. Like the other way around has the same problem. If you looked at one of options 1 through 5, which might make it easy to go from a single field to many fields. But if you go look at all the people who are asking for input unions and see what they're doing something that looks like a tagged union. And it would be a breaking change to migrate from a tagged union to one of these other proposals for an input union. So either way, we face some amount of breakage. We'll just have to kind of document them and make a judgment call for which is the best. But right now, it seems pretty favorable that a tagged union is probably the most promising path for its simplicity and for its ease of adopting existing use cases.
What you said just now about the scalar and object potentially changing between those as inputs reminded me that another problem that we found with structural typing was the existence of the JSON scalar type, where people use actual JSON objects as a scalar. And this does seem to be something that is actually quite commonly used across the GraphQL ecosystem. And because of that, you've just got a JSON object, which means you can no longer sniff it to see what type of thing it is, because it might say, oh, I'm a sheep, but actually it's meant to be a JSON scalar just on its own. So that makes the structural union of scalar and object challenging. But solution 5, the tagged union types, would have no problem with that.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to migrate. The problem with that is you'd have to migrate an existing scalar to a tagged union. And that would be breaking for existing clients that are sending just a plain scalar. That's what I meant about the breaking path. But you're exactly right. That topic came up in our subcommittee discussion. And you end up having to do kind of clever things like evaluating the scalar last, and it kind of gets right back into the whole complexity of like not being able to predict what's going to happen with your input. Other thoughts or questions on tag types?
One thing don't really like, it's called union. I think if we have like two things in a spec that like union, other kind of union, it will create a bunch of confusion. So like I also, if we discuss like all 5 opportunities, I think input union is appropriate. If we start conversing on one-off, I think like we need to think like variant, or like actually in some languages it's called enums, in Rust and Swift, and I initially was another point which is worth, I actually think it's worth to capture in RFC, is that I was opposing one-off initially, and main argument was that add one additional layer in output. But when I look like programming languages, they actually do that, and nobody have like big issues with that, even though that you put like one additional thing for a dot path. One thing I'm really interested into exploring is one of like in protobuf, when it's like separate groups of separate group of mutually exclusive fields, not one group but separate, and it's have like additional benefits that migration pathway is good, because it's, you basically can put it inside any input union you want, any input type you want. If it doesn't have required fields, you can just like throw one off inside and deprecate all other fields. And I think like it will, I think boxing is necessary price to pay, but by allowing like for you to have a couple of boxes in one level, it will save a lot of like boxing, a lot of unnecessary layers, especially like, as I understand, I spoke with dgraph guys, and they're also interested in input unions, and for like database filters and other similar application, having couple of fields, a couple of groups of fields on the same layer is good, and they not intersect, because like properties like columns and tables have different names. So maybe it's also too complicated, but I think it's worth exploring not groups of many fields, but multiple groups of mutually exclusive fields.
I'd be interested in discussing that separately with you, Ivan, maybe with some code examples.
That's a good idea. One thing I do want to highlight that I think is a great suggestion, Yvonne, is being careful about the naming. You know, I think we could maybe kind of shape our way around if we had two types. One type was called union and one type was called input union. Like maybe it would be somewhat straightforward to explain the difference between those two. I think if we have union and tagged union, and one of them, like tagged unions can also be used in outputs, like we're just aiming for confusion there. Whenever someone says union, we're going to have to ask them to qualify exactly what they mean by that. One of the things, I mean, even just in our little subcommittee meeting, we were like shedding a bit on naming, and it started with one of, and then we realized, oh, these are actually kind of tagged unions, and we were using that terminology. I think the naming for this is up in the air, and the RFC should kind of make that clear and kind of bullet out a couple paths that we could use for naming. I kind of intentionally in the agenda just called this tag type instead of tagged union type. I think that's, if we were going to go with something like tagged, then I'd just ditch the word union, and the you know, aspiring CS degree holder can read tagged and know that that means tagged unions, and everyone else can just see tagged. They are all also enum types. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was looking at that and like, dang it, we just reinvented Swift enums, and we already have a type called enum. And actually, it would not make any sense at all to merge these two together, just because the grammar that we have doesn't make that a reasonable thing to do. But yeah, some languages called exactly this type in enum. But like, point taken, we need to be kind of flexible with the naming, and hopefully we'll arrive at something that's both descriptive and easy to communicate to your very beginning point in the meeting, to make sure we pick clear names that reduce confusion.
I would like to point out one thing about what Benji has written up in his gist, which I found that's really good and really useful. So I really like the examples that use the name of the type as the field names, because in a way, what we want is a way to uniquely identify which type it is as the union, and type names already give us that uniqueness. So that's one bit of redundancy removed, and one less thing to think about as a developer or as a schema writer. So I think that part is really good and worth preserving.
That's interesting. I also quite like that approach, but I also like the flexibility of not having to have that approach. And one of the biggest values that we get from not having that approach is this symmetry between the input and the output. So input objects and output objects cannot have the same name. So like, you might have a cat on the output, but a cat input on the input. So when we do that in a tagged, we could actually potentially have two different tags that have the same structure, and they're both called cat, even though one of them is the input type and is called a cat, which is a cat input, and the other one is a cat output type, which has cat, which is just a cat. Sorry if that was confusing how I said that. But yeah, basically that symmetry is a good reason to actually go the slightly more verbose version and give you the flexibility to name the fields whatever you want to call them. That said, I also agree that the shortened form is very nice. So I think for now we're going to stick with the named version, but it is definitely interesting having it.
I'll tell you why I really recommend the named version and would be cautious of using the type name instead. Two reasons. One is for semantics. So if you see an input that says string : and then it's a string, looking at that in isolation, it's not immediately clear what that means. But if you see something that says filter : and a string, you're like, oh, that must be filtering by this string. So the name gives you a tool to describe what it is that you're looking at. So there's semantic meaning there. Then the other one is that if you have these unions, one thing that's actually really nice about the tagged union that's not possible with any of the others is that you can include a type more than once. So for example, Hasura has a pretty complex like database filtering API that allows you to nest ands and ors and filter bys and all these things. And there's like 30 different things you can use. and it's essentially a tagged union. But the vast majority of those fields are strings. So if you imagine you just had like string colon and then like the name of a field you wanted to filter by, it's like, is that an and? Is that an or? Is that a filter? What is that? How do I do more than one of these? You'd end up having to wrap those yet again with like an and type, you know? And so it's like, now you have an and type colon, and now it's the string with your and. And so being able to have more than one of the pieces in the union ends up being really valuable. And if we look back to this examples that we were writing in the previous solutions, a lot of them actually looked like defining a type that had a single field, and that single field had, you know, was a string type, and then we were just unioning them all together. And so we actually ended up in a lot of the examples that we were writing with something that approximated a tagged union anyway. But in that scenario, you have to define every single type. They each end up being a unique type in your schema. And that ends up with some kind of SDL and introspection bloat. So it's kind of nice that the tag type just encapsulates all those in a single definition instead of spread across multiple definitions. So just wanted to make sure you didn't miss that point.
And to expand on that,
totally agree.
Yeah, to expand on that, the existing schemas have them not using the type names in the, I haven't seen any using the type names anyway. So it gives that ability to upgrade to this system, which if we used just the type names, we wouldn't be able to do quite so easily.
That's a really good point. Yeah, bringing it back to adoptability. Cool. I know we've gone into the weeds a bit on this. This was mostly meant to be an update on kind of what we've been up to in those breakout meetings, just to keep the rest of y'all up to date. Obviously, the next step there is to actually draft an RFC that captures everything. I think that's our action item keyword for the notes, to make sure that we have that. And then hopefully we'll have something more concrete to discuss in one of the future meetings. But any other questions, comments, or concerns on the input unions and tag types discussion and direction?
I wonder if there's value in having both the discriminator field approach and the tagged union in regards to symmetry to what we now have as output union types. So the discriminator field approach would mirror that pretty well in a way. Not in the sense that you can just dump the whole structure there, but semantically it's kind of the same. And I'm sure there are use cases for it where it's nicer to use than the tagged approach.
That's a really good question. You know, I think we should lean in the direction of fewer concepts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the right answer here isn't that more than one of these things is warranted. I think we'd have to make a clear case, because anytime you have more than one way to do it, you then have to kind of have a post somewhere that says like, here's how to think about whether to use option A or option B to model things. And so that's just cost that we'll have to factor into that. But you may be right. I think actually in an earlier discussion, not necessarily this last meeting, but a previous one, we did actually discuss maybe we need to, and it wouldn't be totally surprising if we ended up back there. So I'm glad you called that out. It's something we should continue to consider.
I have a question. So like, I personally like one-off, and it's look like we're going there slowly. But I'm interested in, I have some ideas for variation of one-off, like one that I suggested about like groups of like, mutually exclusive, and some other like things that I want to suggest for one-off. But to put it in the same document, it will create more confusion and make it bigger. So what's the right place to discuss like variations for one-off?
I think the best way to do that, correct me if I'm wrong, Lee, would be to propose it as an additional solution in the input unions RFC document. So solution 7, for example. I think if it's sufficiently different, Otherwise, you're welcome to just chat it over with me and we'll see whether it's something that's worth encapsulating. But it sounds like some of these are more broader changes and may actually be a different solution, just like our solution 6 is a combination of 1 and 3.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Although, you know, I view this as a little bit of an inflection point in the discussion on input unions. You know, like this last phase has been about understanding the problem domain, existing examples, research, exploring the solution criteria, and starting to see what the potential paths forward look like. It feels like now we're creating some pretty serious gravity around this direction, and it certainly would be worthwhile. I would love to make sure that we keep that doc up to date with as we learn things, and we've been kind of behind on that. But I do think it's worthwhile to have like a dedicated document that describes like this one solution in isolation. We could link back to the input unions RFC and say, you know, here's the discussion from which this proposal arrives. But it'll be worthwhile because it'll give it some space to really get into detail about all the various things that we've talked about so far, because there's a lot of stuff to dig into there. And that input union RFC is already pretty huge as a document. I saw a chat pop up about asking how to be involved with upcoming meetings. The best way to do that is to hop in on Slack. I think that's how we've been scheduling them in the past, is usually Vince and sometimes Benji will say, hey, we should meet again. When's a good time? And then people will chime in. So I think you've been doing that in the working group channel. But
yeah, it's
hopefully
often in a thread, but we'll try and also copy it into the main channel as well.
Yeah, we'll just try to keep that in the main channel. That way anyone who wants to participate in those breakout sessions can. Although I'm hoping, I mean, those have been incredibly helpful, but I do hope that we can keep some momentum happening asynchronously via writing up these documents. But those meetings are a good deadline and hold us to making sure we maintain progress. So I think it's worthwhile to keep doing them.
The pattern so far has been that they're the week before this, and I see no reason to alter from that. So the week before the next one on the Thursday, roughly the same time, is when we'll try to schedule again. So there's your deadline, Benji.
Yeah, that's why I'm grinning uncomfortably. Yeah, no, that's fine.
No, that's great. I'm excited to see what you come up with.
Yeah, me too.
This is great. You know, we've been talking about this one for literally years, which is not that uncommon for GraphQL RFCs. It takes a while to land on something that we feel like can stand the long test of time. But you know, I think we can confidently say we're making very steady progress, especially just in the last couple of months. So really proud of all the work that's happened there so far. That was our last agenda topic for the day. Is there anything else that we want to discuss before we break? All right, cool. With that, we'll wrap up the meeting, and hopefully you all have your calendars blocked for another hour so you can rest or take a nap or eat some food or do something fun with your day.
Lee, could
Yeah.
me and Ivan talk to you about SpecMD?
Sure, yeah, I'll hang on for a couple more minutes, but I'll let everyone else disappear if you don't care to listen to details about SpecMD.
Cool, thanks, bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
All right, tell me what's on your mind, SpecMD.
Okay, cool. So yeah, basically I was doing this as a proof of concept to see whether it would be feasible or not. So, you know, I've picked your mind a little bit over this. And I think the GraphQL spec is a great test of this because it's quite a big spec. And I have achieved it as far as I'm concerned. There were a few subtle changes to the GraphQL spec formatting to allow it, to the SpecMD formatting to allow for it. Things like adding underscores as emphasis, as is quite common in Markdown. I've also your say, I don't know how you say it out loud. I've only ever read it. C-text, say text, SE text. You know, the dashed underlines.
I also don't know how to say that out loud. Set text.
Set text, that would make sense. It needs an extra T, but yeah, fine, whatever. So since Prettier only wants to output the hash form of the headers, I've come up with a new simpler form of that, which is to bold then the word within the title. So you have the hash and then you have bold the thing. So hash double asterisk title. And that works just fine. So effectively all of your headers are all hashes, but the main one is also bolded, which obviously it's already bold, so you don't see any difference in the output, but it's enough for the for SpecMD to pull out that difference. I've had to do a lot of unescaping of the Markdown that was escaped, dollars, underscores, and asterisks in particular. I've had to rewrite the way that you handle like the underscore character that you use for whitespace. I've had to tweak that. I've introduced another one, which is double underscore, which represents like white space and at most one new line. So that exists now. But basically what that means is that you can now,
let things wrap.
Like, yeah, so when you've got a production like foo, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, if you just do one line feed, it can still continue. If there's two line feeds, then it's definitely a separation. And yeah, this is full on working against the GraphQL spec. I've opened the GraphQL spec with the formatted document so you can see the differences. I've gone through and carefully reviewed every change in it. And I think the only things that were broadly different now in the output HTML is the tables, and that's purely because Prettier formats the tables with an ending pipeline, which means there are spaces after the words, which means SpecMD respects those spaces, and previously there were no spaces at the end of the words at the very last entry in the table line. So it's literally that subtle. It's like there's an extra space character there. Other than that, it's basically
it should probably trim end spaces from tables, right? Because those don't make any appearance on the resulting HTML.
But you're right, because they're inside of a tag. So it's literally only the HTML itself that changes rather than the actual visual output. But you have all the spaces in. That would be a broader change in SpecMD if you were to trim all of those things, which I would be perfectly happy with, but I was trying to keep the HTML diff to an absolute minimum. So maybe that would be a better as a follow-up change. Okay. So yeah, basically it exists. I hacked it together. It took me longer than I was hoping it would. I think it was best part of 8 hours in the end. But that's because I massively minimized the amount of differences in the GraphQL spec itself. I've also done all the GraphQL changes to the spec that I needed to in a separate pull request, such that you can see that there is no difference for those. Yeah. Anyway, so it's all theoretically easy to follow, but broadly, what I need okay from on you is, are you happy with my changes to SpecMD? Because those are necessary for then the changes to the GraphQL spec.
Cool. Any concerns? I haven't had a chance to read your code yet, so obviously I want to do that, and I'll make a priority to do that.
There is one that we actually disagreeing about, because I was mentioning like Benji first, because actually like I want to have a green light on this. So or your concern, basically everything that is a process, everything that is not like change spec in meaningful way, I just might match because it's like, so Benji changed like some formatting, I just match Benji, and like Benji provide divs and URLs that it's not breaking anything. So like except like one thing, because like I review editorial things, and actually like it was quite some changes in grammar, we constantly forget to add or remove something or rename something in grammar, because we have it multiple places. We have like in every section, small pieces of grammar and appendix B with grammar. So like one of the changes is how we format the rules. And
I've just shared it on the chat.
Yeah. So like Benji created great screenshots, and actually like he did like really good research about how to do it properly. I would never guess, but official Markdown spec says you need to add like spaces at the end of the line for it not to like format as one line. So, but I'm having concerns about that because it's hard to alter. Like a lot of people, it was.
Yeah, that one's rough because I know my editor's auto-configured to strip trailing white spaces from lines. I imagine other people's probably also is.
Yeah, and they use like GraphQL GitHub editor, and GitHub editor don't show like spaces at the end.
Yeah.
So, and like every time I get like some PR with changes inside the grammar, even if it's strictly editorial, if somebody just fixing something, I need sure it's like we can include preview links, but it's everything complex. And for me, it's like this issue is just I'm okay with like with doing that, but for me, it's like a sign of a bigger problem, and bigger problem is that we don't distinguish between something that is not text and a text. So for prettier grammar rules are text. So prettier tried to treat the grammar rule as a street text, basically saying like I can put everything in one line. If later we run some spell checker, it can be triggered on some words inside the grammar, even though they're like correct. So like for everything else, for names, for like variables, for name of the algorithms, they like distinguish in some way, which is like understandable for tools. But for grammar rules, they like, except for SpecMD, no other tools know is it like a grammar rule or is it like text. So I agree with Benji that put it in code box. What I suggested is to create different type of code box, something like triple apostrophes, syntax or something. I agree with Benji. If you open like raw Markdown, like GitHub rendering of Markdown, it will look worse. But at the same time, we have clear separation between text and non-text, and we can run like other tools, not only prettier.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know. I'm nervous about that because a lot of like kind of the whole original purpose of this was that the Markdown should look good. Like when you're editing this, you're not typically running a loop with the like SpecMD tool and loading up the HTML page and jump to the right place. Like editors have built-in formatting of Markdown, and it's a good way to gut check that the thing that you're writing makes sense, especially since there's often formatting within grammar rules and algorithm rules. And those formattings have been chosen to work well with Markdown. So I would like to avoid having to just say like, well, they're not Markdown anymore, just wrap them in a code block. I think that kind of defeats the purpose of SpecMD. But I do think there are other paths. Like I kind of agree that having to add trailing spaces is too fragile. I can see other tools just breaking this and this being a pain point for us. But I'm wondering if this was a miss on my part in defining these one-ofs. Like a multi-line one-of should probably be formatted as a list, right? Like maybe what this really deserves is a trailing bullet before each line.
Yeah, but
if it's going to be broken on
I'm not
multiple
sure
lines.
about that. And so I think this is purely a formatting concern, right? You are saying it's one of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, etc. Right? It doesn't matter to the grammar what the format is that you render it out in the docs, right? If we were to trim off one of these double spaces and join those lines together, the actual output, like the true, what the GraphQL spec says would still be the same thing. It's just the formatting of that output would be slightly different. That's all. It's just a formatting concern.
Yeah, but that's kind of the intent of this form of one of, because there's another form of one of that's a single line, and then that one just renders them all out, and it can wrap if needed. This one actually gives you control as the spec author to describe how they appear in a grid.
Sure.
And so there's a reason why this breaks between M and N, right? Like it breaks between M and N because it puts this in a clean 4-column display that makes it easy to see all the alphabet characters, and any other formatting would make this harder to read. So it's kind of intentional that this leaves it in a spot that gives you some control over that formatting.
But my concern is if you add bullets here in the markdown, you're making it less clear what that actually means. So the people who would read it now are like, well, it's one of either this row or this row or this row or this row.
Yeah.
And now there's this extra concept, the bullets, whereas it is pure formatting. So I can see how Ivan's solution of stick it in a code block so that the formatting is persisted, but the meaning stays the same is a potential solution. The other thing that's worth raising, I mean, if you look at the diff for this, you'll see it really only matters in a very few places. Like, broadly, the rest
most
of
the one-ofs are pretty short.
Yeah. So it's really an edge case, and I think being aware of it in that edge case as the maintainer is all that's necessary. And I hear your concerns over the spaces at the end of lines, but honestly, I've been using them in Markdown for like 5 or 10 years. And there are plenty of others. It's the only way to add BR tags rather than paragraph tags.
I honestly learned this fact about Markdown right now. I had no idea. I don't know. It makes me nervous. All my editors are configured to strip new lines. It's probably why I didn't know, or strip white space at the end of a line. It's probably why I didn't know about this feature, is that my editors always just strip them out. I am pretty nervous that this is fragile. You know, I think the only place where I would be concerned about a bulleted list is letter. Letter is the only one that you could potentially read as confusing. Digit, they're all on one line anyway. It's like you could even just delete that new line and it'd probably be fine. The directive location ones are already formatted out as a list, like each one appears on their own line. And so if you put bullets in front of each of them, the markdown semantics would be exactly as you expect them they would be. And so like if this is a quirk that like, hey, we want to preserve this grid formatting for letter, and the quirk of how we do it is bulleted lists, that seems like the least bad option if what we want is the ability to use automated tooling to do formatting, because then that gives us control over that formatting, and that's ultimately what we care about. But yeah, I'm pretty nervous about trailing spaces as a solve, because there are enough tools out there that don't understand Markdown. They just understand text files, and they just strip trailing white space, or they like red highlight it or otherwise kind of flag it as a problem.
I think you can solve that with things like editor config in the spec repo that says don't trim trailing white space in Markdown.
Yeah,
files.
but this is kind of I mean that's my problem with it, is like everyone has their different editor. Like I don't want to have a config file like right now. GraphQL.
Oh, that's why I reference editor config, because it's a global config file for all editors.
I don't think it's have options specifically for that, so I have limited.
Yeah. There's also plenty of other places in here where I like, if someone is formatting anything else in this document and they have trailing white space, it's almost definitely a problem, right? Like any of these other grammar rules that are bulleted lists of options, if you had trailing white space after one of those, then that's a formatting problem. And your editor is right to point out that that's a failure. So like I view this as just a weird quirk of Markdown as, you know, like how else would you differentiate between a line break and a line continuation? But I don't know, my gut read is that we should just avoid that confusion and pitfall of Markdown. There are plenty of other elements of Markdown that you can't use in SpecMD. I'm totally fine if this is one of them.
Wow,
Okay.
good. There is this option for it. I have as a proposal, just quickly check because it's like way faster to do it that way. What about break? There is like a break tag, BR. Can we just add it? I don't know if it's part of command Markdown.
When you start using HTML tags inline in Markdown, some Markdown processors get a little bit confused because they sort of go, "Oh, it's not Markdown anymore; it's HTML now." That's why the double space exists, to insert the break tag.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if we could show that a line break just worked, then I'd be comfortable with that.
One comment in favor of this is it makes the existing Markdown render better, like as is in the GraphQL spec right now, and also this works with the existing SpecMD, so we could like merge this and then update SpecMD to do the asterisks and then migrate to that as a second phase. My main aim with this was to minimize the differences to the spec.
If it's reviewable, if differences are, if like you're able to review them manually, I don't think differences in output is a big issue. It's an issue if you review them.
Right. I mean, to be clear, I would expect the SpecMD output to be identical. If we decided to add the ability for multi-line one-ofs to start with a bullet, then the SpecMD AST would just omit the fact that there was a bullet there. Like it's just a quirk of the Markdown aspect of it, and then the built HTML would be identical. So this is just a matter of like, what is the appropriate way for us to format multiple lines of a multi-line one-of in the original Markdown form? And I really don't like trailing white space just because tools can get confused, and I really don't want to have to include editor config because I think there's plenty of other places where trailing white space would be considered an error. So I think like the bullet in the front is also, it's semantically weird. I agree with that, but I think what we have to do is kind of pick the least bad option. And it's not semantically weird for most of these one-offs. It's only semantically weird for a letter.
You actually said you have like two forms of one-off. So if you already have a two form, can we have like second form require bullets by syntax? In that case, we will have two forms instead of three forms.
I think they're the same form that you can see in the diff here. It's just that the letter one has multiple on one line rather than just one. Is that right, Lee? Yeah, there's two forms. There's one-ofs that appear. It's basically the difference between like an inline or a blocked HTML element, right? Like one inline is just a space separated list, and the other one is a grid. It just so happens that the executive query declarative location and type schema declarative location or directive locations, those are a grid that happen to have one column, whereas digit is a grid that has one row, and letter is a grid that has multiple rows and columns. To argue against myself, one advantage of using the bulleted approach as well is it means where the syntax that you're using, like the backticks and whatnot, make the line wrap where you don't want it to, the asterisk would say explicitly, here's what will be a line, even if it actually wraps in the Markdown. So that's
kind of the whole point of this grid form. And I think that's probably part of why you see me kind of turning my nose at this approach is the whole point of the second form is to give you control over how that grid lays out. The other thing that we could do, which would be maybe even more weird is actually format it like a table. You could format it like a markdown table, just without header columns. It's not super crazy because it would kind of read like OR bars, but it might be a little too syntactically noisy. But that's not the craziest thing in the world. But my sense is that bulleted lists would be just like a slightly simpler solution.
One thing we need to consider, that's why like I'm against tables. People in academia, they like grammars and they like to publish research in grammars. So I expect if GraphQL continue on trajectory of success, people start publishing academic papers about GraphQL grammar, and everybody in academia will have facepalm if we start doing one-off as tables, because they it's a bad way for a research paper to formulate grammar, and they like use data and other stuff. So even like bulletin list, it's like it's quirk, but it's not weird in that application. But tables are like
I don't. It's a quirk. It's like half on one, half on the other. This quirk is borrowed from the C API and the JavaScript API. Both format their literal identifiers this way, just as a matter of like fitting their how do you describe your like what letters and numbers are allowed in identifiers in an 80-column document. They line break it, and they line break it in this form because it's easiest to read. So that's where this form originates. So I think anyone who's a language researcher is gonna not be surprised when they see letter is formatted in a grid or in a table or in some weird fashion, because it's typically that case. It's either that or you format it as Unicode ranges, but that tends to make people even more confused or angry.
I think I actually figure out like what I want to do, because I still want to use some like LinkedIn rule for, or LinkedIn thing for Markdown, like prose or some other like technical writer linter. And this is my main concern, that the same issue will bite us in the second time. So instead of like blocking or be suspicious about it, like probably action item for me is to actually try this tool. And if they don't like react to like current form or to like what you're proposing, one of your proposals, I'm like total. So my main concern is that if we're able to use like technical writers linters or not. So I will, action item for me is to try it in much of, I will try to find some time like end of this week, next week, to try to configure something, because I know that they exist, but I never tried them, so I need to pick one and like run it.
Yeah, my hope is that if the goal here is to be able to use prettier, then as long as we run that one last in a whole phase of linters, then the linters can do whatever ill-fated fix that they want, because prettier will always kind of format it correctly in the end. But
no,
but you're right that we should test it.
I mean, like linters in a sense that they will check like prose, they will check like, because one of the issues is that Benji doing a great help reviewing PRs, because I'm not a native speaker. So I'm totally not touching anything related to grammar or spelling or anything like that, or British or American English. So like I'm worried that we will have like mixture of like somebody use some British words and somebody use American words. And because I'm like co-founder in one of startup and we're doing stuff for technical writers, I'm aware that there is such tools, this solve this problem of having like, you can specifically forbid like saying it's only American English or British English and not like a mixture of both. So actually like, okay, to untangle with, I will try it and I will report inside an issue.
Okay,
And
sounds good.
I'm okay with like anything that work with such tools.
Sounds good. And Benji, I'll make it a priority to look at your spec MD changes and see if there's anything else that jumps out at me.
Cool. I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is this is just the hacked out code to make it work. It's not like I haven't bothered to structure it for full code review. I want you to okay the concepts that I'm doing before I worry about structuring the code right. Secondly, it's a breaking change, so it would be a major version bump. I think broadly, like it would run against the existing GraphQL spec without any change in behavior, but I'm not sure. Are there other people using SpecMD that you know of?
There are other people that are using it, but certainly GraphQL is the biggest. So I think as long as we can kind of point to in what scenarios it will break, then we can at least talk about them and see if there's a way to reduce the break surface area. And if we can't, then we'll just kind of talk about it when we make a version bump.
I think broadly,
that way anyone that is using it can fix.
I think broadly it will just be a case of run the new version against it and see if the HTML is the same. If it's the same, fantastic. If it's not the same, now you need to fix something. But broadly, I think it will give you the same output in most cases. Yes, what else? Yeah, mostly it's just a change to the grammar, subtle changes about how underscores are handled. I've had to split a few tokens up into more productions so that we can handle them in the way. And also, I'm not familiar with Peg.js. Like this is the only time I've used it. So if there's things that I'm doing that are wrong or could be done better, I'd love that feedback.
I'll let you know. Yeah, writing SpecMD was also an opportunity for me to learn Peg. And so I stumbled a lot before I finally figured out good ways to make it work. So if I spot anything that looks like a way I messed up in the past, I'll certainly let you know.
Awesome. Yeah, and the other thing I guess is this change with the asterisks. Would that be for existing users of SpecMD? Is that going to cause any ambiguity? Like, is it already accepted that a hyphen or an asterisk could be an entry in a one of, rather than the fact that it makes a bullet, if you see what I mean?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So that I think that's technically a breaking change. So we should highlight it as such.
Okay, and you want to support the one-off syntax with just new lines as well as one-off syntax with a bullet character?
I think that's the safest approach, because that means that's actually the worst breaking case, because it could be that people are using multi-line one-ofs, but like having a bullet as actually an option in one of your one-ofs and it just happens to be the first character in the list, it's like, that is a theoretical possibility. Sure, someone could be using it that way. Are they? I don't know. But like, is someone using a multi-line one-of? Probably. And then if we made it a requirement to have those lines, then that makes migrating more difficult. Also, I think it would be nice if what we can do is first make changes to SpecMD, do a release, pull that release into the GraphQL spec and run it. And then now we have the new capabilities, and then we can start landing any additional changes. So like if you wanted to add the bullets in the one of right now, the resulting HTML output would be incorrect, right? So you couldn't land such a change until SpecMD landed. So you don't want to make it so that you have to update SpecMD and then also change the spec text in the same commit.
Yeah, okay, that's reasonable. I was trying to think of ways that would break, but I think so long as we're not running prettier yet, we'd effectively, what I keep on having to do effectively is do the changes, make the changes to the spec that need to be made, run prettier on it, check the output of the SpecMD HTML, make sure it's the same, and then go back to the beginning again. It's quite cumbersome work, but yeah, I think that's probably the best route forward.
Yeah.
Get to the point where SpecMD3 runs against the existing Markdown, and then do another pull request, which is prettification of the Markdown with no HTML changes.
And depending on how we're able to do that, we might actually be able to get away with a change that's not version 3. You know, it'll make it so that all existing documents continue to format as expected. And so we can make a decision whether that warrants a breaking change and go to version 3.
I think I would make it a version 3 just from the point of view that A, it does theoretically break some things, and it's a big change in the grammar.
You might be right.
But B, it's a major feature being able to support prettier, which it couldn't before. So I think that is a thing worth, like SpecMD now supports prettier. Like that's a big thing. So I would put a big number on it.
Cool. Yeah, I think I agree with you.
That's just my opinion.
I like it.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to leave it with you to review. I don't want to do any more work on it until I've got your like, yeah, this looks okay, or no, this is terrible.
Cool. Yeah, that's on me.
Okay. Awesome.
Like, as an idea, can we add like a prettier to test suite of SpecMD saying like prettier shouldn't break, like have a kitchen sink document and as part of SpecMD run prettier to prevent like things like that in future or easily detect. Another thing, I don't know, because you get so much GitHub issues. Another small thing, not to discuss here, but just to leave a comment. We had discussion about Google summer of Google season of documentation.
Season of docs.
Season of docs, yeah. So we will get like 1 or 2 slots, and we have like 4 projects. If you want something to include there, like I think like it would be great to have some help with the spec, but not as 3 months and not from a person who's not really familiar with what they do. So,
I'm expecting we'll get more help from Season of Docs on GraphQL.org.
Yeah. So here, this is actually like nobody made idea for GraphQL.org. I submit GraphQL.js docs.
That's a great idea too.
Yeah, frequently asked questions, like to make frequently asked questions. So Uri, as part of preparation for that, Uri is championing moving GraphQL.org to Gatsby without touching any content. So idea is like don't touch anything, don't redesign anything, because previous attempt failed. Like you remember with Tanai, he championed, but it's not his fault. It's just like nobody like reviewed his work, nobody like give him direction what to do. So this iteration is not to change anything, even like style, colors, leave everything as is. Just move like system to Gatsby.
I like that.
Yeah. Okay. So because we discussed it like with Brian and everybody, but like so wanted to get confirmation it's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Everything. That's basically everything.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right, folks. Have a good evening.
Cheers, Lee. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.